Right before we dive in, let's make this story bigger than just me and you. Tell me in the comments, what part of the world are you watching from, and what's the clock striking there? Morning, night, or somewhere in between? I want to see how far this story can reach. Now lean closer. Here's where it all begins. The rope burned against Remy Thibodaux's wrists as he hung suspended from the old oak tree behind the Beaumont Ranch house, blood dripping from his split lip onto the dusty ground below. 3 hours ago, he had been the most feared outlaw in Louisiana Territory. Now he was trussed up like a Christmas turkey, watching the woman he thought he loved check the knots with the cold efficiency of a professional hangman. Evangeline Beaumont stood beneath him in her Sunday dress, but there was nothing innocent about the way she tested the rope's strength or the calculating gleam in her dark eyes. "You really thought I fell for your charm, didn't you?" she said, her voice carrying the musical accent of French Louisiana mixed with something harder than desert stone. Poor Remy, thinking a rancher's daughter would run away with a killer and a thief. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with sickening clarity as Remy watched her signal to riders emerging from the cottonwoods, federal marshals who had been waiting for this moment like vultures circling a dying man. The romantic picnic she had suggested, the isolated location behind her father's property, even the way she had insisted he leave his guns with his horse. It had all been carefully orchestrated to bring him to this moment of absolute helplessness. "The reward on your head is $5,000, dead or alive," Evangeline continued, her voice now completely devoid of the breathless affection she had shown him for the past 3 months. "But I negotiated a bonus for bringing you in conscious. The families of the men you killed want to look you in the eye before they watch you hang." Her words cut deeper than any blade, revealing the depth of the deception that had ensnared him completely. As the marshals approached with their shackles and warrant, Remy looked into Evangeline's face one last time, searching for any trace of the woman who had kissed him under the stars and whispered promises of a future together. What he saw instead was something that chilled his blood more than the approaching gallows. She was smiling, and it was the most beautiful and terrible expression he had ever witnessed on a human face. 6 months earlier, Remy Thibodaux had ridden into Vermilion Parish like the devil himself was chasing him, which wasn't far from the truth. The Thibodaux gang had just robbed the Shreveport Bank, killing 3 guards in the process, and every lawman from Texas to Mississippi was hunting them with blood in their eyes. What Remy needed was a place to lay low, let the heat die down, and plan his next move away from the territory that had become too dangerous for comfort. The Beaumont Ranch sat in a valley surrounded by live oaks and Spanish moss, isolated enough to provide sanctuary but prosperous enough to suggest that its owners were successful rather than desperate. From his hiding place in the tree line, Remy studied the property with a professional eye, noting the quality of the horses, the condition of the buildings, and most importantly, the routines of the people who lived there. What he didn't expect was to see the most beautiful woman in Louisiana hanging laundry on the line behind the main house. Evangeline Beaumont was 22 years old and built like a goddess carved from ivory and gold, with dark hair that caught the sunlight and a figure that could make angels weep with envy. She moved with unconscious grace as she worked, humming French melodies that drifted across the fields like music from another world. When she looked up and saw him watching from the forest edge, instead of screaming for help, she smiled and waved as if he were a welcome neighbor rather than a dangerous stranger. Their first conversation happened over the fence that marked the boundary between civilization and wilderness, with Remy maintaining the pretense that he was a traveling cowboy looking for work, while Evangeline played the role of an innocent country girl charmed by his rough good looks and easy manner. She invited him to dinner with her father, Claude Beaumont, a widower who seemed grateful for any company that might make his daughter smile. Within a week, Remy had taken a job as a ranch hand, using skills learned during his younger, more honest days to prove his worth, while carefully concealing the guns and stolen money hidden in his saddlebags. Evangeline treated him with a combination of shy attraction and bold flirtation that kept him off balance, making him believe that he was the hunter, when in reality, he was already caught in a trap more sophisticated than anything he had ever encountered. Claude Beaumont was a man who had built his fortune through careful planning and calculated risks, turning a small cattle operation into one of the most successful ranches in Louisiana Territory through sheer force of will and business acumen. He welcomed Remy with the hospitality of a Southern gentleman, but his eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who had survived and prospered in a dangerous land by never fully trusting anyone. Over dinner in the ranch house's formal dining room, Remy found himself spinning elaborate lies about his past while studying the family that had taken him in. The house itself spoke of prosperity and refinement, crystal chandeliers, imported furniture, and paintings that suggested education and culture far beyond what most frontier families could afford. But it was Evangeline who captured his attention completely, the way she moved through the conversation with easy confidence and sharp wit. "Papa always says that a man's past is less important than his future," Evangeline said during that first dinner, her dark eyes meeting Remy's across the candlelit table. "What matters is what he does with the chances he's given, not where he came from or what mistakes he might have made along the way." The words seemed directed specifically at him, as if she somehow knew more about his situation than she was letting on. Claude nodded approvingly at his daughter's words, but his gaze never left Remy's face as he spoke. "Evangeline has always been an excellent judge of character," he said with paternal pride. "She can see through pretense and deception like most people see through glass. It's a valuable gift in a world where appearances can be deceiving." The comment felt like both a compliment and a warning, delivered with Southern politeness but unmistakable steel beneath the velvet. As the evening progressed, Remy found himself drawn deeper into the family's warm embrace, feeling emotions he had thought long dead stirring in his chest. For the first time in years, he was experiencing what it felt like to be welcomed rather than feared, to be seen as a man rather than a monster. But even as he basked in their acceptance, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that something about this perfect family was too good to be true. The courtship unfolded like something from a romantic novel, with moonlit walks through the oak groves and stolen kisses behind the barn, while Claude pretended not to notice his daughter's growing attachment to the mysterious stranger. Evangeline seemed to blossom under Remy's attention, her laughter becoming more frequent and her smile brighter with each passing day. To anyone watching, they appeared to be two young people falling genuinely in love against the backdrop of Louisiana's natural beauty. Remy found himself changing in ways he hadn't expected, the rough edges of his personality smoothing under Evangeline's gentle influence, while his capacity for tenderness awakened after years of dormancy. He began to imagine a different life for himself, one where he could leave his criminal past behind and build something honest and lasting with the woman who had captured his heart. The stolen money hidden in his saddlebags seemed less important than the treasure he held in his arms each evening. Evangeline encouraged these feelings with subtle skill, talking about their future together in terms that made escape from his outlaw life seem not just possible, but inevitable. "I've always dreamed of seeing California," she would say while they sat by the pond watching the sunset. "They say it's a place where people can start fresh, leave their old lives behind, and become whoever they want to be." Her words painted pictures of redemption and renewal that made Remy's criminal past seem like a bad dream from which he was finally awakening. The physical attraction between them was undeniable, but it was the emotional connection that truly ensnared Remy's heart. Evangeline seemed to understand him in ways that no one ever had, accepting his rough background while encouraging the better angels of his nature. When she told him she loved him for the first time, standing in the moonlight with Spanish moss hanging around them like nature's cathedral, Remy felt as if he had been reborn into a world where anything was possible. But even as he surrendered completely to love's sweet deception, Remy couldn't shake the feeling that Evangeline was holding something back. That there were depths to her character he hadn't yet explored. Sometimes he caught her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, as if she were studying him rather than simply admiring him. These moments passed quickly, replaced by her usual warmth and affection, but they left him with a nagging sense that he was missing something important about the woman he had come to adore. Life on the Beaumont Ranch settled into a rhythm that felt more natural to Remy than anything he had experienced during his years as an outlaw. He threw himself into the work with enthusiasm that surprised even Claude, demonstrating knowledge of cattle and horses that could only come from genuine experience rather than criminal deception. The other ranch hands accepted him gradually, won over by his competence and his obvious devotion to the boss's daughter. Claude began treating Remy less like a hired hand and more like a potential son-in-law, including him in business discussions and asking his opinion on matters of ranch management. "You've got a good head for this work," the older man said one evening as they reviewed the books together in his study. "A man who understands both the practical and business sides of ranching could go far in this territory, especially if he had the right backing and connections." The conversations about the future became more specific and enticing as Claude painted pictures of expansion and prosperity that could include Remy as a full partner rather than just an employee. "Evangeline will inherit all of this someday," he said with casual generosity. "But a ranch this size needs a strong man to run it properly. The right husband could help her build something even greater than what I've achieved." The offer was clear even though it was never stated directly. Marry the daughter and inherit an empire. Evangeline herself seemed to encourage these discussions, often commenting on how well Remy had adapted to ranch life and how much her father had come to trust his judgment. "Papa hasn't been this enthusiastic about anything since Mama died," she told Remy one evening as they walked through the gardens behind the house. "You've given him something to look forward to again, a reason to plan for the future instead of just managing the present." The domesticity of it all was intoxicating to a man who had spent years living from robbery to robbery, never sure where his next meal would come from or whether he would live to see another sunrise. Here was stability, prosperity, love, and acceptance. Everything he had never dared to dream could be his. As autumn painted the Louisiana landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Remy began making plans to retrieve his hidden money and confess his past to Evangeline, convinced that their love was strong enough to overcome any obstacles his criminal history might present. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a travel-worn rider who refused to stay for breakfast, despite Claude's hospitable invitation. Remy was shoeing horses in the barn when he heard Evangeline's sharp intake of breath from the house, followed by the sound of rapid conversation between father and daughter. Something in their tone made him abandon his work and move closer to the window, though he couldn't make out the specific words being exchanged. When Evangeline emerged from the house, her face was pale, but her expression was carefully controlled, as if she were working hard to maintain her composure in the face of disturbing news. "Everything all right?" Remy asked, noting the way her hands trembled slightly as she folded the letter and tucked it into her dress pocket. "You look like you've seen a ghost or received bad news from somewhere." "Just family business," she replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Nothing for you to worry about, my dear. Papa sometimes gets letters from his business associates that require careful consideration." But there was something in the way she avoided his gaze that suggested the letter's contents were more significant than she was letting on. And for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Remy felt a flicker of the old paranoia that had kept him alive during his outlaw years. That evening, Claude was unusually quiet during dinner. His attention focused on his plate rather than the conversation flowing around the table. When Evangeline tried to draw him into discussion about expanding the horse breeding operation, He responded with distracted murmurs rather than his usual enthusiastic engagement. The easy family dynamic that Remy had come to cherish felt strained, as if invisible tensions were pulling at the fabric of their domestic tranquility. Later that night, as Remy walked Evangeline back to the house after their usual evening stroll, she stopped suddenly and turned to face him with an intensity that was startling in its sudden appearance. "If you ever had to leave here quickly," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "where would you go? What would you do?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, and the way she asked it, with genuine concern rather than idle curiosity, sent cold fingers of dread walking up Remy's spine. The second letter arrived 3 days later, and this time Remy was close enough to see the federal postmark that sent ice water coursing through his veins. He watched through the barn window as Claude read the message, his weathered face growing increasingly grim with each line. When the rancher looked up and met Remy's eyes across the yard, there was something different in his expression. Not hostility exactly, but a new wariness that suggested the comfortable familiarity between them had shifted into something more complex. That night, Remy lay awake listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into sleep while his mind raced through possibilities and escape routes. The smart thing would be to saddle his horse, collect his hidden money, and disappear before dawn, putting as much distance as possible between himself and whatever storm was gathering around the Beaumont Ranch. But the thought of leaving Evangeline was like a physical pain, worse than any bullet wound he had ever endured. The next morning brought a stranger to the ranch, a well-dressed man riding an expensive horse who claimed to be a cattle buyer from New Orleans, but whose eyes moved over the property with the systematic attention of someone conducting reconnaissance. Remy watched from a distance as Claude and the stranger talked on the front porch, noting the way Evangeline joined the conversation with perfect social grace while somehow managing to position herself where she could observe both men simultaneously. "Who's your visitor?" Remy asked Evangeline later, trying to keep his voice casual despite the alarm bells ringing in his head. "He doesn't look much like a cattle buyer to me, too soft around the edges, too clean for someone who spends time around livestock." The question was partially a test, a way of gauging whether she would continue the pattern of evasion that had begun with the first letter's arrival. Evangeline's hesitation before answering was brief, but noticeable. A momentary pause that confirmed his growing suspicions that something significant was happening beneath the surface of their peaceful routine. "Just business, as Papa said," she replied with forced lightness. "But you're right. He does seem more comfortable with paperwork than with cattle." "Perhaps he's one of those city investors who thinks he understands ranch work from reading books." But her laugh sounded hollow, and Remy began to understand that his past had finally caught up with him in the one place he had thought was safe. The third stranger arrived the following week, and this one made no pretense of being anything other than what he was, a federal marshal whose badge caught the morning sunlight like a star of judgment pinned to his chest. Marshal Henri Dupuis was a Creole from New Orleans, whose reputation for tracking fugitives was matched only by his reputation for bringing them back alive when possible, but dead when necessary. His presence at the Beaumont Ranch could mean only one thing. Remy's identity had been discovered. Claude's greeting of the marshal was cordial, but formal, the kind of reception given to an official visitor rather than a welcome guest. Remy watched from the barn as the three of them, Claude, Evangeline, and the marshal, engaged in conversation that looked casual from a distance but carried undertones of serious business. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to collect his belongings and disappear into the bayou country before the trap could close completely. But when Evangeline looked in his direction and smiled, waving as if nothing unusual was happening, Remy felt his resolve waver like a candle flame in the wind. That smile held all the warmth and affection he had come to depend on, all the promise of a future that seemed worth any risk. Surely, if she truly loved him, she would find a way to warn him, to help him escape before the law could claim him. The thought that she might be involved in his capture was too painful to seriously consider. The marshal stayed for lunch, and Remy found himself invited to join the gathering in a move that felt more like a summons than a courtesy. Sitting across the table from the man who was undoubtedly there to arrest him, making polite conversation about weather and cattle prices, while Evangeline served sweet tea and smiled at everyone with equal warmth, felt like dining with death itself. Every moment stretched like hours, every casual question from Dupuis seeming to carry hidden meaning and threat. "You remind me of someone I'm looking for," the marshal said casually as he finished his meal, his dark eyes studying Remy's face with uncomfortable intensity. "A man who's been causing considerable trouble across several parishes. But of course that fellow's probably long gone from Louisiana by now. These criminal types rarely stay in one place long enough to put down roots or form genuine attachments." The words were spoken with the lazy confidence of a cat playing with a mouse, and Remy understood that his time was running out faster than sand through an hourglass. That evening, Evangeline suggested they take their usual walk, but instead of heading toward the pond or the oak grove, she led him deeper into the property than they had ever gone before, following a path that wound through dense vegetation toward what appeared to be an abandoned section of the ranch. Her manner was different, less playful and more purposeful, as if she were leading him somewhere specific, rather than simply enjoying his company. "I need to tell you something," she said when they reached a small clearing dominated by an ancient oak tree whose massive trunk and spreading branches created a natural cathedral in the wilderness. "Something I should have told you weeks ago, but I was waiting for the right moment." Her voice carried a seriousness that made Remy's already heightened nerves spark with additional anxiety, and he found himself studying her face for clues about what was coming. The confession, when it came, was delivered with the calm precision of someone who had rehearsed the words many times. "I know who you are, Remy Thibodaux," she said, her eyes never leaving his face as she spoke. "I've known since the day you arrived. The federal marshals have been looking for you for months, and when they learned you might be in this area, they asked for Papa's help in capturing you safely." The words hit Remy like physical blows. Each revelation worse than the last, as the carefully constructed world he had built around their love affair crumbled into dust and betrayal. "You've been lying to me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper as the full scope of the deception became clear. "Everything, the romance, the family dinners, the talk of our future together, it was all just an elaborate trap to keep me here until they could spring their snare." Evangeline's expression remained steady, but something flickered in her eyes that might have been regret or pain. "Not everything," she said quietly. "The feelings were real, Remy. I didn't expect to actually care about you. Didn't plan to find myself genuinely attracted to a man I was supposed to be helping capture. But that doesn't change what has to happen now." Her admission of true emotion made the betrayal somehow worse, adding the weight of lost love to the burden of approaching justice. The silence stretched between them like a chasm as Remy processed the revelation that the woman he loved had been his captor from the very beginning. Every tender moment, every whispered endearment, every promise of a shared future had been calculated moves in a game where he was the prey and she was the hunter. Yet looking into her eyes, he could see genuine pain there, as if the betrayal was hurting her almost as much as it was destroying him. "How long?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "How long have you known what I did, who I really am?" The question carried the weight of someone seeking to understand the depth of the deception that had ensnared not just his body, but his heart. If she had known about the murders, the robberies, the violence that had defined his life before coming to the ranch, then her acceptance of him had been the cruelest lie of all. "From the beginning," Evangeline admitted, her honesty now as devastating as her earlier deception had been. "The marshals brought us photographs, descriptions, even reports from witnesses who had seen you in various towns. When you appeared at our ranch, Papa recognized you immediately. But instead of trying to capture you by force, we decided to keep you close while they prepared their case. Remy felt something break inside his chest, a snapping sensation that was part heartbreak and part rage as he understood how thoroughly he had been manipulated. "And the feelings you talked about?" he asked, hating himself for needing to know but unable to stop the question from escaping. "Was any of it real, or are you just that good an actress?" The possibility that even her emotions had been fabricated was almost too painful to contemplate. Evangeline stepped closer to him, her hand reaching out as if to touch his face, before she seemed to think better of it and let her arm fall to her side. "The feelings were real," she said, her voice carrying conviction that was either genuine or the product of remarkable acting skill. "I fell in love with the man you became here, not the outlaw you were before. But that doesn't change what you've done, Remy. It doesn't erase the people who died because of your choices, and it doesn't mean you can escape the consequences of your actions." The sound of approaching horses broke through the emotional tension like thunder through a clear sky, and Remy understood with crystalline clarity that this isolated clearing had been chosen as much for its privacy as for any romantic ambiance. Through the trees, he could see riders moving into position with the practiced efficiency of men who had conducted many similar operations, federal marshals surrounding the area with methodical precision while their quarry was distracted by matters of the heart. "You brought me here to be captured," Remy said, the statement carrying no question, because the answer was written in the positioning of the approaching lawman and the careful way Evangeline had maneuvered him away from his horse and weapons. "This whole evening, this confession, it was all designed to get me away from the ranch house where I might have had a chance to fight or run." Evangeline's nod was barely perceptible, but her eyes held something that might have been apology or regret. "They wanted to take you at the house, but Papa was worried about stray bullets hitting the other ranch hands or damaging property. This way seemed cleaner." Her voice carried the weight of someone who had been forced to make choices between bad and worse, but her words provided little comfort to the man who was about to pay the ultimate price for her family's practical considerations. Marshal Dupuis emerged from the tree line with 3 deputies, their weapons drawn but not yet aimed, suggesting they hoped to complete the arrest without violence if possible. "Remy Thibodaux," the marshal called out in his formal, authoritative voice, "you're under arrest for bank robbery, murder, and a host of other federal crimes. Surrender now, and this can end peacefully for everyone involved." Remy looked around the clearing with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years evaluating escape routes and tactical disadvantages. But the marshals had positioned themselves too well and moved too quickly for him to have any realistic chance of breaking free. His guns were back at the ranch house, his horse was too far away to reach, and even if he could somehow overcome 4 armed lawmen, he would still have to deal with the painful reality that the woman he loved had been the architect of his downfall. "I suppose this is where you tell me you're sorry," Remy said to Evangeline, his voice carrying bitter amusement rather than the rage or despair she might have expected. "Where you explain that you had no choice, that you were just doing your duty as a law-abiding citizen." But even as he spoke the words, part of him was still hoping she would deny them, would find some way to prove that their love had been real enough to overcome the circumstances that had brought them together. Instead of the apology or justification Remy expected, Evangeline did something that shocked everyone present. She stepped between him and the marshals, her body forming a human shield while her eyes blazed with sudden, fierce determination. "Wait," she said, her voice carrying an authority that made even Marshal Dupuis pause in his advance. "There's something else you need to know before you take him, something that changes everything about this situation." The marshals exchanged glances, clearly caught off guard by this unexpected development from someone they had counted as an ally in their operation. Miss Beaumont, Dupuis said carefully, step away from the prisoner. Your part in this operation is complete, and we appreciate your family's cooperation. But this is now a matter for federal law enforcement. His tone was polite but firm, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. My part is far from complete, Evangeline replied, her stance becoming more protective as she positioned herself more squarely between Remy and the advancing lawman. And he's not just a prisoner. He's the man who saved my life 3 weeks ago when bandits attacked our supply wagon on the way back from town. He could have run then, could have left me to die and disappeared into the bayou country, but instead he chose to fight for me. The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun, and Remy felt his understanding of recent events shift once again as new pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The supply run that Evangeline had insisted on making alone, the bandits who had seemed to appear from nowhere, his own decision to follow her when his instincts warned him to maintain distance. It had all been orchestrated, but perhaps not in the way he had originally believed. Is this true? Marshal Dupuis asked, his professional interest clearly piqued by this unexpected complication. Did this man engage in lawful defense of a citizen, even knowing that doing so might expose his location to federal authorities? The question carried legal implications that were obvious to everyone present, because defending an innocent person from attack could be considered mitigating circumstances in any subsequent trial. Evangeline's revelation continued to unfold like pages from a book written in languages none of them had expected to read. The bandits weren't random criminals, she said, her voice gaining strength as she committed fully to whatever course of action she had chosen. They were hired by the Mercier family, whose son Remy killed during the Shreveport bank robbery. They've been hunting him for months, not for justice, but for revenge, and they don't care who gets hurt in the process. Remy stared at her in amazement, understanding dawning in his mind like sunrise over dark water. You knew they were coming, he said, the pieces of her complex plan finally becoming clear. You knew they would try to kill me, and you used yourself as bait to draw them out where I would have to choose between my own safety and yours. The audacity of her strategy was breathtaking, but so was the risk she had taken with her own life. The Merciers have been hiring killers and bounty hunters to track you down, Evangeline explained, her eyes never leaving Marshal Dupuis' face as she spoke. They've made it clear they want you dead, not captured, and they don't care about legal process or federal authority. When Papa and I agreed to help with your arrest, it was partly to protect you from something worse than prison. Marshal Dupuis lowered his weapon slightly, his professional instincts clearly wrestling with the unexpected complexity of the situation. Are you telling me that this entire operation was designed not just to capture a fugitive, but to prevent a lynching? He asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the legal and political implications of such a claim. The confession that followed revealed the full scope of the Beaumont family's involvement in Remy's fate, and it was far more complicated than a simple cooperation with federal authorities. Claude Beaumont had been contacted not just by the marshals, but by representatives of the Mercier family, who had offered substantial rewards for information about Remy's whereabouts. The choice had been between turning him over to legal justice or abandoning him to vigilante vengeance, and the Beaumonts had chosen the option that offered at least the possibility of survival. There's more, Evangeline said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper as she prepared to reveal the deepest layer of her deception. I'm not just a rancher's daughter who happened to fall in love with an outlaw. I'm a federal agent, working undercover to infiltrate criminal networks operating in Louisiana Territory. My assignment was to get close to you and gather intelligence about your gang's operations and future plans. The revelation hit Remy like a physical blow, rewriting everything he thought he understood about their relationship and his situation. The beautiful, innocent rancher's daughter had been a mirage, replaced by a trained professional whose skills at manipulation and deception were clearly far beyond anything he had encountered in his criminal career. Every moment of tenderness, every whispered promise, every shared dream had been part of an assignment rather than genuine emotion. Marshal Dupuis nodded grimly, as if this revelation had been expected rather than surprising. Agent Beaumont has been working this case for over a year, he confirmed, his formal tone acknowledging her professional status. Her intelligence gathering has been instrumental in identifying and locating several criminal organizations operating in this region. Your capture was always the primary objective, but it was never the only one. But the feelings, Remy said, his voice breaking as he struggled to reconcile the woman he loved with the federal agent who had been manipulating him. You said the feelings were real. How can they be real if everything else was a lie? The question carried the desperation of a drowning man reaching for any piece of floating debris that might keep him afloat. Evangeline's mask finally cracked, revealing glimpses of genuine pain beneath the professional facade. Because somewhere along the way, the assignment became secondary to the person, she admitted, her voice thick with emotion that seemed too raw to be fabricated. I was supposed to get information and facilitate your capture, but I wasn't supposed to fall in love with you. That part was never in the plan, and it's made everything infinitely more complicated than it should have been. The standoff in the clearing had transformed from a simple arrest into something far more complex, with emotional, legal, and professional considerations, creating a web of competing loyalties that defied easy resolution. Marshal Dupuis found himself facing a situation where his federal agent had compromised her objectivity, his prisoner had demonstrated heroic behavior, and the entire operation was being complicated by factors that existed outside normal law enforcement protocols. "What are you asking me to do, Agent Beaumont?" the marshal asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that his next decision would have consequences far beyond this single arrest. "Are you requesting clemency for a federal fugitive based on personal feelings and one act of heroism? Because if so, you're asking me to ignore my oath and my duty to uphold federal law." Evangeline straightened her shoulders, her bearing becoming more formal as she shifted from lover to professional advocate. "I'm requesting that you consider all the evidence before making your final decision," she said, her voice gaining strength from her training and experience. "Remy Thibodaux has committed crimes that deserve punishment, but he's also demonstrated capacity for change and heroism that suggests rehabilitation rather than execution might serve justice better." Remy listened to them discuss his fate as if he were a piece of evidence rather than a human being, but he found himself more interested in watching Evangeline's face than in the legal technicalities being debated. The federal agent was clearly skilled at her profession, but glimpses of the woman he had fallen in love with kept showing through the official facade, suggesting that her earlier confession about genuine feelings had been accurate. "There's one more thing," Evangeline said, reaching into her dress pocket to withdraw a folded document that she handed to the marshal. "A full confession and complete intelligence report about every criminal operation Remy has been involved with, including locations of stolen money and names of accomplices still at large." He provided this information voluntarily as part of his cooperation with federal authorities. Marshal Dupuis read the document with growing amazement, his eyebrows rising as he processed the scope and detail of the intelligence Remy had unknowingly provided. "This is comprehensive," he said, looking up at both of them with new understanding. "If this information is accurate, it could lead to the arrest and conviction of dozens of criminals currently operating throughout the territory. The value of this cooperation could indeed be considered mitigating circumstances." Remy stared at Evangeline in shock, understanding dawning as he realized how thoroughly she had extracted information from him during their months together. Every casual conversation about his past, every story he had shared about former associates, every detail about hidden caches and planned operations had been carefully recorded and analyzed by a trained intelligence operative. The pillow talk had been an interrogation, and he had been too blinded by love to notice. "You've been building a case against my entire organization," he said, his voice carrying wonder rather than anger at the scope of her deception. "Every time I told you about the old days, every story about the gang's operations, you were taking notes, weren't you? Creating a map of criminal activity that goes far beyond just my own crimes." The realization was both humbling and oddly impressive, evidence of professional skill that was remarkable even by outlaw standards. "It's what I do," Evangeline replied simply, her eyes meeting his with something that might have been apology or regret. "But the information you provided was given freely in trust, which makes it more valuable than anything we could have extracted through formal interrogation. That trust means something, Remy. It has to count for something in the final accounting." Marshal Dupuis was clearly wrestling with competing considerations, his duty as a federal officer warring with his recognition that this situation had evolved far beyond normal arrest protocols. "Agent Beaumont," he said finally, "are you personally vouching for this man's potential for rehabilitation? Are you willing to stake your professional reputation on the belief that he can be reformed rather than simply punished?" Evangeline's answer came without hesitation, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had wrestled with this decision through sleepless nights and reached a conclusion that felt right, despite its professional risks. "Yes," she said firmly. "I am personally vouching for Remy Thibodaux's character and his potential for positive contribution to society. Based on my months of observation and interaction, I believe he deserves a chance at redemption rather than summary execution." The clearing fell silent, except for the sound of wind through the oak leaves and the distant calls of night birds beginning their evening songs. Marshal Dupuis studied both faces before him, clearly weighing factors that went far beyond simple law enforcement considerations. The federal agent who had compromised her objectivity, the outlaw who had demonstrated heroic potential, and the intelligence windfall that could reshape criminal investigations throughout the territory, all of these elements had to be balanced against federal law and departmental policy. "There is a precedent," the marshal said slowly, his words carrying the weight of someone who had found a potential solution to an impossible problem. "Federal fugitives who provide substantial cooperation in the capture of other criminals can be offered reduced sentences or alternative forms of punishment. If Mr. Thibodaux were willing to continue his cooperation and assist in the capture of his former associates, arrangements could potentially be made." Remy felt hope stirring in his chest for the first time since the trap had been revealed, but it was hope tempered by understanding of what such cooperation would mean. "You're asking me to betray my former partners," he said, stating the obvious with the directness of someone who had no illusions about the moral complexity of his situation. "To become an informant and help you hunt down men who trusted me as a fellow outlaw. I'm asking you to help bring dangerous criminals to justice," Marshal Dupuis corrected, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. "Men who have killed innocent people and terrorized communities throughout this territory. Your cooperation could save lives and restore peace to regions that have been living in fear. That's not betrayal. That's redemption." The words carried weight that Remy could feel in his bones, the possibility of transforming his criminal expertise into something that served justice rather than undermining it. The decision that followed was perhaps the most difficult of Remy's life, requiring him to choose between loyalty to his criminal past and hope for a legitimate future. Looking into Evangeline's eyes, he could see the woman who had genuinely fallen in love with him despite her professional duties, and that love had become the most important thing in his world. "I'll do it," he said finally. "I'll cooperate fully with federal authorities and help capture every member of my former gang. But I have one condition." Marshal Dupuis raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by what demands a captured outlaw might think he was in position to make. "What condition?" he asked, his tone suggesting he was willing to listen, but not necessarily to agree to anything that might compromise federal authority or legal procedures. "Agent Beaumont is removed from this case," Remy said, his eyes never leaving Evangeline's face as he spoke. "Her professional objectivity has been compromised by personal feelings, and continuing to work with me would put her career at risk. I won't be responsible for destroying the future of the woman I love, even if it means I have to face whatever comes next alone." The sacrifice was clear to everyone present. Remy was willing to give up the one person who might advocate for him in order to protect her professional standing and future opportunities. It was a gesture that spoke to genuine love rather than selfish manipulation, and even Marshal Dupuis seemed moved by the selflessness it represented. Evangeline's reaction was immediate and passionate. "No," she said firmly, stepping closer to Remy despite the weapons still trained on him. "I'm not abandoning you now, not after everything we've been through together. My career is my responsibility, and I'm willing to face whatever consequences come from my choices. But I won't let you face this alone when I'm the one who brought you to this point." The emotional standoff was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders, but these were not additional federal marshals. Through the trees came a group of hard-faced men whose presence sent ice water through Remy's veins, the Mercier family and their hired killers, armed to the teeth and clearly intent on taking matters into their own hands rather than trusting federal justice to satisfy their need for vengeance. "Well, well," called out Jean-Baptiste Mercier, the patriarch of the family whose son Remy had killed during the bank robbery. "Looks like we arrived just in time for the hanging, though I have to say, federal marshals seem to be taking their sweet time about dispensing justice to cop killers and murderers." His voice carried the ugly satisfaction of a man who had been anticipating this moment for months. Marshal Dupuis turned to face the new arrivals with the practiced calm of someone accustomed to dealing with vigilante interference in federal operations. "This is a federal arrest, Mr. Mercier," he said authoritatively. "You and your men need to stand down and allow legal process to proceed according to law. Any interference will result in additional federal charges being filed." "Legal process?" Mercier laughed, the sound harsh and bitter in the evening air. "Your legal process has been chasing this animal for months while good people continue to die. We're here to provide the kind of justice that actually works, permanent and immediate." His men began spreading out in a formation that suggested they were prepared for violence if their demands weren't met peacefully. Evangeline found herself in the impossible position of protecting a man she loved from both the law she served and the vigilantes who wanted him dead. Drawing her own weapon for the first time since the confrontation began, she positioned herself where she could cover multiple angles while keeping Remy behind her. "Stand down, all of you," she commanded, her voice carrying federal authority. "This man is under federal protection as a cooperating witness, and anyone who harms him will face the full weight of federal prosecution." What followed was a standoff that tested every principle of law, love, and justice against the brutal realities of frontier vengeance. But it was Remy himself who broke the deadlock, stepping out from behind Evangeline's protection to face Jean-Baptiste Mercier directly. "You want justice for your son?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of genuine remorse. "Then take it, but leave these people out of it. They're just doing their jobs." "Remy, no," Evangeline said, her voice breaking as she realized what he was offering. "You don't have to do this. We can find another way, work through the legal system, protect you from this kind of vigilante justice." But her words carried the desperation of someone who knew that sometimes honor demanded sacrifices that love couldn't prevent. Marshal Dupuis, however, had been thinking while the confrontation developed, and he stepped forward with the authority of federal law backing his words. "Mr. Mercier," he said formally, "I'm prepared to offer you something better than vigilante vengeance. Mr. Thibodaux has agreed to cooperate fully with federal authorities in dismantling criminal organizations throughout this territory. His information has already led to warrants for over 20 dangerous criminals, including the men who planned the robbery that killed your son. The offer hung in the air like a bridge between vengeance and justice, giving the grieving father a choice between immediate satisfaction and long-term impact. You're saying this man's cooperation could prevent other families from suffering what we've suffered? Mercier asked, his voice carrying the first hint of uncertainty since his arrival. 6 months later, Remy Thibodaux stood in a federal courthouse in New Orleans, no longer in chains but wearing the badge of a federal deputy marshal. His cooperation had indeed led to the capture and conviction of 37 criminals, effectively dismantling 3 major outlaw gangs and bringing peace to regions that had been terrorized for years. Beside him stood Evangeline Thibodaux, now his wife as well as his federal partner, their love having survived the test of deception, duty, and danger. Jean-Baptiste Mercier was in the courtroom as well, not as an enemy, but as a witness to the transformation of the man who had killed his son into someone who dedicated his life to preventing others from walking the same dark path. "Justice," he said quietly to Marshal Dupuis as they watched the ceremony, "sometimes looks different than we expect, but it finds its way to where it needs to be. In the end, love had not conquered all, but it had transformed everything, turning an outlaw's fall into a lawman's rise and proving that redemption was possible even for those who seemed beyond saving."